Hi, I'm Ellie Anderson.
And I'm David Peña-Guzmán.
You may know us as co-hosts of Overthink podcast, as well as this YouTube channel, and we're here today to talk about the question, what is philosophy for? David, you want to start us off?
It's such a broad question. It's hard to know how to begin because, of course, philosophy is a lot of things and it is for many things. But maybe one place to begin here, I'm going to draw from an article that was recently published in Aeon magazine. And it's an article that was recommended to us by one of our fans and listeners. It's a piece by Peter West.
You read the email, so I didn't know. This is new. I'm not feigning surprise.
But there is this article by Peter West in this magazine called Philosophy is an Art. And Peter West in this piece talks about this philosopher from the middle of the 20th century by the name of Margaret Macdonald, who is writing, working in England. She's sort of at the center of the British philosophy establishment in the middle of the 20th century, which was not easy to do for women at this time. And she wrote an article in 1953 called Linguistic Analysis and Perception. And even though it is about linguistic analysis and about perception, it really is about what is it that philosophy does in the grand scheme of things. And so she tries to look at what it is that philosophers rely on in terms of the language game that we call philosophy. So when you look at philosophy as a language game that follows certain rules and patterns,
Very
what do you...
Wittgenstein
influence.
influence.
And she was very, very much influenced by Wittgenstein. And she says, we have this idea that philosophy ought to be kind of like a science. But when you really get down to it, when philosophers put forward theories about the world, those theories are not really like scientific theories. They're not falsifiable. They're not verifiable. And so it means that philosophy is not like science. It's actually a lot closer to art. And that leads Macdonald to say that philosophy, in the end, much like literature, much like art, much like poetry, is there to enhance and deepen facets of the human experience through different forms of storytelling. Through presenting visions of reality, of human life, of human existence, of human history, that just make us relate to ourselves in a more profound way, but you cannot, according to her, apply the categories of science and empiricism to that function.
Yeah, which is a really common claim. I mean, that idea that philosophy is more like art than like science is a pretty common claim, but even more common than that claim is that philosophy is not like science, regardless of whether it's like art. And that idea, I've never heard of Macdonald before, but that idea recalls to me a couple of different other ideas. One, perhaps surprisingly, because it sounds like she's a very analytically trained philosopher, writing in the 20th century, comes from a less analytically trained philosopher in the 20th century, Gilles Deleuze, who talks about philosophy in terms of concept creation. Now, I think he's probably thinking about this in a much more radical sense than Macdonald is. But he also has this beautiful passage in Difference and Repetition where he says to write philosophy like a detective novel. And obviously that's not saying that philosophy is of the same status as a detective novel, right? It's not fictional in the same way, etc. But it's to
There's
say
no crime.
But there's that idea of suspense, of hooking people in, and I think there's a resonance there. And it also reminds me a bit of one of the things that Socrates says in the Phaedo, the dialogue that depicts his approach, basically like his last day before he's dying. The day of his death. I don't know why that's so hard to say. His last moments and hours before he dies, the kind of conversation that he's having. He's speaking with his friends in, engaging in philosophical dialogue and also sharing a myth. That's sort of the final act of the Phaedo, if we're talking in terms of conversation. And one of the things he says there is something like, what better way to spend our days than sharing stories?
Yeah, the sharing of stories, you're right. I do want to point out, though, that even though now it's quite common to kind of group philosophy with the humanities, with literature, poetry, and so on, especially for somebody like Macdonald, who is writing as analytic philosophy is sort of taking form in the 1950s in England, in these kind of conservative institutions like Oxford, for example, or Cambridge. Yeah. That at that time, philosophy was not seen as literature and as storytelling.
Yeah.
There, the idea was that philosophy really is a handmaiden to science.
Yeah.
And contributes to the scientific project through concept clarification, through linguistic analysis, and in some cases just by dismissing theories that science should reject on logical grounds. And so, in that context, I think it was a much more radical position to take, but I really like this idea of Deleuze, of thinking about philosophy as concept creation, but also as a police detective novel. Yeah. And there's another philosopher who is a reader of Deleuze, Vinciane Després, who works out of Lille in I think she's Belgian, but she's working in France. And she recently wrote a book that is about philosophy in connection to animals. And she says that philosophy should be like a police investigation. And she uses that phrase. And so I think maybe she's taking this from Deleuze.
Interesting.
And she says that what a police investigator does is they come to a scene, like a murder scene or, the house of a suspect. And instead of looking for patterns, they always are looking for the thing that doesn't quite fit.
Okay.
The thing that stands out, that is an aberration or an anomaly. And that what we ought to do as philosophically inclined thinkers is precisely to do that. To always focus on what is out of place, even if it pretends to be in the right place. And I kind of really like that idea as a kind of let's say lodestar for philosophical thinking, How do I go where other people are not looking?
So I love that. I think that describes what philosophy is for really nicely. And I also want to note that both Després and Deleuze are using an analogy there. They're not saying philosophy is a detective novel or that philosophy is a police investigation. And so if we take seriously this idea that philosophy in some respects, let's leave the police investigation aside, but talking about art, that it's like art, we're still acknowledging implicitly that philosophy is not art, right? It's we're saying that there are certain respects in which philosophy is similar to art or shares techniques with art, but that it's still somewhat different. And I would say I tend to agree with that. So I'm curious for us to think about, on the one hand, the fact that philosophy does involve storytelling. It involves thought experiments and or myths and or analogies and other forms of storytelling as well. It can certainly be conveyed through fictional works. But it also is not fiction, right? There's something else at work. There's a different, what we might call truth procedure, to use an idea from Alain Badiou that I will probably not return to, but that I just coming up as a term here. The reason I say I will not return to it here is not because I think it's like a bad idea. It's just because I'm not prepared to actually give the account of that because it's been a while since I read it. But thinking about how the ways in which the sort of narratives that we tell in philosophy are different from those in art. And I think my first crack at this would be that philosophy ultimately is trying to give an account in the sense of logos in the ancient Greek, the ancient Greek term logos, which was really important to people like Socrates. And that account can be an explanation, right? It can be a metaphysical explanation. What are the basic constituents of the universe, such that we can explain, how we find ourselves. It can be a moral explanation too. But of course, explanation is not the whole story either. The tradition of phenomenology is much more about description than explanation. But that description isn't just a fictional description or even a rich memoir-like description. It's not what some of the early people working in phenomenology critiqued as picture book phenomenology or worldview descriptions. It's rather an accounting of the essential structures of experience.
Yeah, so I mean, here there are two questions that come up for me. The first one is that if we are willing to differentiate philosophy from art, then it seems like we do have to move philosophy from the storytelling camp closer to something like a scientific camp. Unless we just say that it's a third thing on its own, with its own properties, and then we can talk about those.
Well, it depends on how we're defining science. Is it a Wissenschaft in the German sense? Because then it is a science. But if it's a natural science, then maybe not so much.
It wouldn't be, right? Like, even just the notion of experimentation.
Yeah, and falsifiability, as you mentioned.
Exactly. And so I'm much more open to the idea that philosophy is art by other means, that it is art and storytelling, maybe with a closer eye to argumentation and reason and logos. But and this is the second thought, my hesitation about equating philosophy with logos is that that's giving too much credit to philosophy's own historical self-understanding. Mm-hmm. So that's how a lot of philosophers have defined.
Yeah, of course.
Philosophy in terms of logos. And typically, the other that is sort of cut off from philosophy through that operation is myth. Mm-hmm, right? Mm-hmm. Like, that's the differentiation in ancient Greek philosophy between mythos and logos. And that is that logos is about reason, and mythos in Greek just means storytelling, actually. Mm-hmm. And I actually think that philosophy itself engages in a lot of mythification and mythologization. It tells stories, it tells myths, sometimes quite literally, in the sense of like talking about mythology. But I think a lot of philosophical theories can be hard to differentiate from more classical mythic accounts.
Okay.
And so the distinction for me is a lot less stable.
But I think we can acknowledge everything you just said and still say that there is a distinction in terms of aims and in terms of verification, perhaps. I mean, and I think we could think about verification more broadly than in terms of scientific falsifiability, which has to do with experimentation. Because, like, take the case of your own work. Mm-hmm. I presume that it matters to you whether the account you're giving of animal consciousness, to talk about an area about which you've written a lot, is right or not. Mm-hmm. Certainly whether I'm right or not matters a lot to me. Now, I don't think that whether I'm right or not is as clear cut as it might be in the case of whether an experiment works or not. But I do still think that there are lots of clues that we can use, whether it's through argumentation or, reasoning processes generally. There are certainly some experimental means, in the case of animal consciousness, right? There are certain clues that we can get from science. So I presume that it matters to you whether it's right or not. And that would suggest to me that what you're doing is importantly different from engaging in myth.
But I think this is where the but this is where the Macdonald point kicks back into gear, because let's just take the case of animal consciousness, right? So if somebody says, I think animals in general are machines that don't have a lot of sentiment and don't have a lot of complexity in terms of their inner world, and somebody else says, I think they're fully animated beings with a soul, though neither concept is truly open to falsification or verification. There are different ways of looking at animals in this case that can illuminate different aspects of animal experience, but there's never going to be what in science is sometimes called a decisive experiment, one that pushes you to choose between one theory and the other one decisively. So for example, in physics, if somebody says light behaves this way and somebody says no, light behaves this way, then you conduct a critical experiment that is designed specifically to force a choice between the two, and that cannot exist.
Okay, sure.
In the case of philosophy.
But you agree with one of those views and disagree with the other, right? Or you disagree with both?
Which views? Sorry.
The two views that you mentioned, the machine-like idea of animals and or the soul view of animals.
I would lean toward the soul, even though that's not a concept that I would use, because I do think it illuminates aspects of experience more richly.
So that shows that this is different from myth. You don't agree or disagree with a myth or work of fiction.
No, correct. But I do think that philosophy entails the creation of visions and stories whose status is not true or false, but rather whose function, and this is, the question of what philosophy is ultimately for, is to enrich our relationship to our surroundings. But that's why I'm maybe resisting your appeal to the concept of verification.
Well, but that was only part of it, right? And I do want to, I have an answer to this question too that I want to bring in. So we can move on from this in a moment. But I do just want to say, I think all of what you're talking about shows that there is a role for myth, fiction, art in philosophy, but does not show that philosophy has the same ontological status as art, or that philosophies do. Yeah.
Yeah, but okay, so just a quick example here. Think about Hegel.
And then let's move on because I want to talk about,
Hegel has a complete, and this is true of the big systematic thinkers. You know, they have this gigantic, all-encompassing narrative or story about the world and the universe and the cosmos. I'm not really sure that that's not myth under some description. Can we envision ways to falsify or verify Hegel? Not quite. Is it better or worse than other philosophies? Sure, but maybe we're talking about what Macdonald would call different temperaments, that we select between theories in philosophy kind of based on taste and personality.
Yeah, I mean, that's a well-known point from William James. I just don't think that means that... Like, I agree with you that when we write philosophy, we are undertaking something that partakes of myth, for sure. And I think, you see that already in Socrates. I just don't think that I want to say that there's no difference between the two. I think the aims are ultimately very different. And I do think the fact that we assent one over the other is different. Wait, can I say my thing?
Yeah, go for it. I was going to say, but we know that we disagree about this point, actually, on the boundaries of philosophy. And the philosophy. Yeah,
and I think I'm right and you're wrong. And I don't think I'm
and how is that verified?
I don't think I'm in performative self-contradiction there, but I think you can't say that you're right and I'm wrong, because you would find yourself in performative self-contradiction if you think that philosophy is just fictional or artistic.
No, I would just say that my view is more illuminating.
But okay, so this actually leads me to what I wanted to bring into this conversation, though, which is, so what is philosophy for? I think you already mentioned this idea of enriching life, and I think that is really getting at something. I mean, first off, I want to say that the framing of the question, which was actually, posed to us by one of our assistants, is already telling, I think, of certain values in our society, because the question is not what is the value of philosophy, but what is philosophy for? That is a question about its utility. Our culture very often equates value and utility, but I do not think that those two should be equated. I think utility is a value and utility has value, but I don't think it's value, tout court. Yeah. And so I think I just wanted to note that. Okay. So I think we could be having a slightly different conversation if the question were what is the value of philosophy. So in terms of what is philosophy for, I think my immediate answer that came to mind here is that of Cicero, which is to philosophize is to learn to die. Mm-hmm. And that idea that to philosophize is to learn to die proliferates in the ancient world. And then Michel de Montaigne picks up on it in the Renaissance. And I think to ask that question is basically, to say that, to make that claim, is basically the same as to say that to philosophize is to learn to live. Because I think what philosophy does, and I can say this has very much been the case in my own personal life, is constantly remind us of our mortality. Yeah. Be like, you've got this life. You got to make the most of it. And not the most of it in terms of some self-optimization, accepting the values of a messed up society, but really in the sense of, and there's no way to say this without sounding cliche, making each moment count, taking every day seriously, accepting life in all of its forms. Life is, for the most part, really unpleasant for most people. And kind of putting that into perspective has been really helpful, I think, for me. And I do want to just read a quick quote from Montaigne here, that is from his essay, that to philosophize is to learn to die, where he says, premeditation of death is premeditation of freedom. He who has learned how to die has unlearned how to be a slave. Knowing how to die frees us from all subjection and constraint. And I think that association of learning to die with freedom shows how deeply connected learning how to die is with learning how to live, as well as the fact that philosophizing is ultimately a way of life, and that it can connect really powerfully to contemplative, spiritual practices of community, all of these other really juicy things that I think many have seen as valuable over a very, very long period of time.
Yeah, I mean, this Ciceroian, although also Seneca has some writings on the subject of how to die.
Yes, Seneca's essay on the shortness of life was one of my first philosophy pills.
Oh, really?
Yes.
And so, yes, it has a clear Stoic orientation, taken by Montaigne, who runs with it. I sometimes worry that this conception of philosophy as learning to die through meditations on the fleetingness, the ephemeral character of life, is somewhat internalist and can lead to a largely passive relationship to one's surroundings, where the point is not so much to change your surroundings, but to sort of accept the conditions under which you live and maybe come to terms with mortality, which you can do without altering your material environment. And so I think there is that possible danger to this Stoic line of thinking about philosophy. But I do like it, especially because it foregrounds the value of philosophy for the individual, right? For the individual who partakes in it and whose life becomes richer precisely by appreciating how short it is. As you said, it's hard not to sound like a cliche, but to really take each day as if it were your last.
Yeah. Well, but I feel like everybody always says this about Stoicism, that it just leaves the material world intact. And I think you see a version of that in Hegel, who describes Stoicism and the phenomenology of spirit as having a kind of negative conception of freedom. I just feel like this line, it's almost become a meme at this point, and I'm not sure that it's right. I mean, first off, I actually don't think an emphasis on individual living is a bad thing. I think oftentimes we appeal to, but what about the communal, without recognizing that actually learning how to live better for your own life is guaranteed to make you a better person in the world, and also allows for much more of a domain that you can change than your external surroundings. But I would also say, so I think the root of where this idea comes from is in the Stoic notion. I know this is not about Stoicism, so I promise this point will be short, but it's in the Stoic notion of playing your role, right? So you see in ancient Stoics this idea that everybody has a role to play in the web of nature, and your task, your duty, is just to live up to that role. Yeah. And so I think in a day and age where people don't have as fixed roles, and we understand that people shouldn't have such fixed roles, that rubs us the wrong way, which I think is I think it's right. Like I don't want to defend that view, but I think that's different from saying that you shouldn't try and change your circumstances. I actually think it's quite compatible with the idea of living and being in the world and transforming things.
No, I think it is definitely compatible, which is why I mentioned that simply as a danger rather than as something that is front and center about Stoicism, that it can lend itself to that other reading. But maybe we can pivot a little bit, because I also wanted to mention a slightly or a rather significantly different conception of what philosophy is for that comes from the French philosopher Henri Bergson, who in his book Creative Evolution, which came out in the 1920s, says that the value and the function of philosophy essentially is not necessarily to tell us how to live, or even to tell us how to die, even though he doesn't say that, but rather to make us do violence to ourselves by...
Not where I thought this was going.
Philosophy is the intellect doing violence to itself by breaking apart the categories that we have inherited from the past, and especially from evolution. And so he believes that because we are obviously products of natural, organic, Darwinian, not Darwinian, he has his own theory about evolution, but because we are organic products of nature, we come into the world already with certain biases, certain prejudices and ways of thinking. So, for example, we naturally, he says, divide the world into parts and think in a spatial way rather than in a more fluid, continuous way. Mm-hmm. And that means that our intellect, it already has a certain orientation and a certain frame of mind that it applies to the world. But sometimes by following the path of philosophy, which for Bergson is really tied to the labor of introspection, to looking within and trying to describe and analyze experience, we come to see the limits of the world as it is revealed to us by our natural categories. So he kind of takes a Kantian approach where he argues, we have these categories of understanding that are just part of our subjectivity.
Yeah.
But he believes that we can rupture them through philosophy, and that is what philosophy is for. Well, it is to break the categories.
Yeah, and I'm less familiar with that text than some of Bergson's other works, but I would venture to guess, based on my knowledge of Bergson, that for him would be actually a way of returning to the immediacy of experience as well, right? So we're getting rid of these categories that have removed us from the immediacy of experience.
Yeah, because he says, we have these categories that are spatial, that are geometric, that are very formal, and they work really well when you apply them to inanimate objects, to matter. But there are some things in the universe that don't work like inanimate matter, namely the things of life, like organisms, like ourselves. And so when you start thinking about those objects that don't fit into the mold that our mind has because of its evolutionary lineage, that reflection on those things puts pressure on your mind to the point that it stretches them to a point of no return.
Okay.
And he says that once you pass that point of no return, you know that you have philosophized. And so he does have this really interesting kind of explosive interpretation of what philosophy is there for.
Well, we should probably close out.
Great. So as you know, we encourage you to listen to our podcast, which you can access on any platform where you typically access your favorite podcast, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, so on and so forth.
Like and subscribe here on YouTube, please.
Yes, and we also encourage you to consider joining our Patreon community, which would allow you, in some cases, to come and hang out with us in our monthly Patreon meetings, and also to have access to special content on our platform.
Thanks so much for watching.